okay? Good. Can everyone hear me? I've got quite a loud voice anyway, so good. You can hear me at the back. Excellent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Confessions of a Visualforce Dinosaur. My name is Christopher Allen Lewis. I'm an independent software developer at CloudClue and also an MVP. And this is my Twitter handle should you have any comments, questions that you think of after the presentation, or if you'd like to hear my general Salesforce ramblings. So with a title like that, you're probably wondering what this is all about. Well, it's really to kind of summarize what it's been like to be a Visualforce developer over the past 4 years as Lightning has come into our attention. And then also some top tips for making the transition from using Visualforce to Lightning, and then talking a little bit about what the future is going to bring for us. Is Visualforce still valid in the future? So we're going to start off this story like you do any good story, which is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or to be a little bit more accurate, 4 years ago in Bristol. At that time, I was a Visualforce developer. I'd been working with the platform for about 5 years. And I could do pretty much anything with the platform. You know, render a PDF nicely, no problem. Make a wizard, easy. I felt like, you know, a Salesforce genius. All this stuff was far, far easy. And that year, I was lucky enough to go to Dreamforce, the big conference in San Francisco. And I was really looking forward to what kind of announcements they had, what they were going to bring. In previous years, it had been Chatter, Salesforce 1, so it's all very exciting. And boy, did they have a big announcement for us. Not just one thing, not just 3 things, but like a gazillion things that were all branded Lightning. We had the new experience, the new UI, the new entire platform that was based on their Aura framework, and the design system, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, after seeing this, we all went back to our day jobs, we all went back, and then over the next course of the year, Lightning became generally available. And of course, it's at that point that we all moved straight away, didn't we? We abandoned Visualforce and everyone moved to Lightning. Not quite. So why? And I think that's an interesting point to start off where we are. Why at that point in 2015 did we not make that transition? And I would try and answer that question, but I can't. There's really only one person who can. And it's not Mark Benioff. It's Les Dennis, who, back in 2015, you might not remember this, did a special edition of Family Fortunes as to why we didn't use Lightning. So try and cast your mind back to when Lightning first came out and try and think of the reasons why that happened. Any ideas? Shout them out. Anything. It was slow. Very good. Top answer. OK. So, yeah, if anybody remembers one of those initial demos that they did to anyone when using Lightning, it took about 10 to 20 seconds to even show anything. And that's not really what you want to show people. That's not really progress, if you see what I mean. Any other ideas?
Feature parity.
Feature parity. Exactly. Exactly. God, you're good. This is really good. Yeah, so remember when it first came out, Service Cloud didn't even exist. You couldn't use that in Lightning. All these essential things that we built up over time just weren't there. And of course, there's a few other answers. There's things like the implementation effort. It wasn't just a case of just applying a new tag or applying a new attribute. We had to completely rethink about the way we were going to do things. And also, in amongst that whole idea of missing features, you also had a very reduced component library. I heard stories at the very start of Lightning coming out about people who spent weeks on end building a date picker, which I didn't really fancy doing. And also, there's other things like maybe you didn't like the new style, maybe you still preferred Classic at the time, especially things like the sidebar that you used to have that was always a little bit confusing. And some people at that point, despite all the marketing, despite everything else, just didn't really know what Lightning was. So it's no surprise with all these things in 2015 that we weren't really embracing it and weren't really using it and were still happy to use Visualforce. It was familiar and we could use it very well. But over the years, and there has been a lot of releases since then, and it's actually quite startling to me to think it was at that Dreamforce 3.5 years ago, that it has improved a lot since then. And some of those concerns, for me anyway, have started to go away. It's a lot faster now. It loads at the same speed of Visualforce. Okay? There's no longer the 10-second delay. And the features have improved. There's a lot more tags. Every release, it gets better and better. But over time, I was still stuck with those same ideas that I'd had in 2015. I still believed that Lightning was just this technology I didn't have time for, I didn't want to touch. And I guess the real difference came up About in summer last year, where actually Lightning brought out the Community Cloud. I was asked to do a community project for a client of mine, and I was looking at different options at the time. And that's when they brought out the nice Lightning-based Community Designer. And this was actually, compared to the stuff that communities have been based on before, I don't know if you ever had the pleasure of using Kur or Kakua or whatever the names were, but they were really inflexible and really hard to use. Here we had something that was component-based, that was drag and drop, that was nice, and that we could actually start to develop useful things for. So I made the decision to go with it and actually start using Lightning. And so here is some of the most useful lessons that I learned during my process. And it's always nice to have a slide with Lego on. I managed to get it in every presentation. But basically, your approach to design in Lightning has to change completely. You're no longer about large monoliths, you're about little components. So think about if you're given the challenge of developing some kind of Visualforce technology, even though we have components already there in Visualforce, the approach is usually the same. My approach was already start a new page and then just code and go, and just spill it out all in one massive go. And what that results in is in an app or a page that is not very flexible, is very difficult to maintain, and is very difficult to adjust. I mean, you only have to think of the scale of some of the things that we beautiful developers created. So you've all done, who's done a Visualforce page before? Put your hand up. Now, how many of those were over 1,000 pages? 1,000 lines, sorry. 2,000 lines. 3,000. Yeah, we're talking several thousand here. I remember seeing one that was 7,000 lines long. And I thought, that's not really the way to go. And it's because Salesforce doesn't really, it never put any restrictions on you in terms of doing that. There were components, but it was never enforced. With Lightning, that's a lot more visible. It's actually actively encouraging you to develop in this componentized style. So start with some basic building blocks, and then make it something a bit more useful, and think that you just want each component to do one specific thing, not all the things. One of the really daunting things about getting started with Lightning component development is actually when you first load one up in the developer console, you're not greeted with your usual friendly, hello world, I'm a simple Visualforce page. You've got 8 different attributes that make up a Lightning component. And what's more, to confuse it even more, one of them is called component itself, and one is called controller. And this isn't an Apex controller. So really, as you're starting to develop, take time to recognize what each of these things do. And this is really important because the component is where your markup is, but it's also where you define all your attributes. Previously, when using Apex controllers, we define all our parameters, all our arguments, everything in there. You don't do that anymore, and that's because Lightning is much more based on the client, not on the server. What's also really helpful here is you've got the style component, which is where you hold your CSS. And remember I talked about componentization. It's all about zooming in on that particular area or element and choosing what that looks like. Again, I refer back to my massive monoliths of Visualforce pages, where if you had some styling to do, you would probably have a massive list of CSS at the top. And then actually managing that, you're going down there and then up there and then down there to actually, and searching the entire file just to work out why something looks the way it looks. And speaking of the way things look, documentation, design, and SVG control how your component appears in the app builder, the kind of logo it is displayed with, and also the parameters that you can pass in there. And I will talk about the renderer in a second. So building on that idea that there is a lot more emphasis on the client this time, your relationship with Apex becomes very, very different. It's no longer about maintaining any kind of state. And if you seem to remember, this is why small operations seem to take a long time sometimes on Visualforce pages. Things like, you clicked one button and you just wanted to render a different section. There was always like a second delay there. And that's because you're sending your entire page state to a server, sometimes in America, only for it to come back and be displayed in an entirely different way. By putting more emphasis on the client and actually doing all those little visual tweaks as part of the client side, you're not having to make that massive communication. It's all handled there. And that's why sometimes Lightning takes a little bit longer to initialize. It's actually putting all that logic in the client. So the idea is, with Apex controllers, you should be only using it for things that actually require the server. Things like DML and SOQL, because not all the data will be in your client. Otherwise, it would take a really long time to load. Also, calling external web services and doing some complex business logic that's reusable. You might not want to do this. This is a bit simple, but something a bit more complicated, yeah. Now, I had some real fun with the renderer. I talked about this, about how this was one of the elements, one of the attributes of a component. Now, this may look slightly familiar to people, this idea of you have re-render lists, obviously not on a page as simple as this, but again, we're talking about massive pages, and you sometimes might have your list of re-renders, which are an absolutely massive list of all the components that you have on the page. And it's what I like to call re-render-getty, as in it's a spaghetti mess of re-renders that you're clicking one button and you're asking to re-render things across all the pages, which is very, very difficult. And I thought, okay, so this renderer here, this is effectively Lightning's same way of doing the same thing, right? Is that, once the action is finished, once my component's done something, it's then going to call this renderer, and that's going to manipulate everything. And as soon as I also read in the Salesforce documents that it manipulates the DOM, I was like, yeah, we're aware this is what it's going to do. But this is actually for custom rendering, and I would really recommend you stay away from it. If you're trying to manipulate the DOM early on in your Lightning projects, there's something quite awry. It should be an absolute last resort. So please don't get into the same mind frame as I did. But something that is really helpful is Lightning events. Now, what this basically is, it's a really, really simple model of kind of if this, then that. And basically before, whenever you did any kind of Visualforce page in an Apex controller, the things were intrinsically tied together. They were really locked in place, and you could find it very, very hard to adapt. With Lightning components, the idea is if you want something to change on the screen as a result of someone's action or something changing, then you create an event. And basically, the component will broadcast that event, and then the other components will have listeners to listen to that specific event, and so you have a real disconnect there in a very positive way. If you want multiple things to listen to one particular thing happening, just create another component with another listener. And it doesn't matter if all the listeners go away, the event can still get fired and nothing will happen. So it's great to have that lack of dependency. And I guess what I'm kind of trying to summarize by going through all of these different points is you can see how the big, large pages that we had in the past, which contained a lot of re-rendering, which contained a lot of complicated code, they're no longer fit for purpose. And by going through this process of componentizing and splitting into individual elements, it's really forcing you down a path of thinking about how you can break up things into smaller chunks, and it becomes a lot easier. And it makes it a lot easier for everyone else as you're picking up that code. It's a lot easier to look at 100 lines and work out what's going on there, rather than try and decipher 7,000 lines. So there are many really, really good ways of debugging Lightning. There's even a lovely Inspect Lightning component app that you can put in Google Chrome that will show you the timescales. But I'll be perfectly honest, if you're anything like me, when you debugged your Apex and Visualforce, it was just system.debug. System.debug absolutely everything. And you can see what's happening and then run it, obviously, and you see it in the debug logs. Now, the new alternative to that is console.log, which is a standard JavaScript command that basically puts it out to your developer console here, which you can usually access in Chrome by right-clicking and go to Inspect, or through the developer tools in Internet Explorer or Edge. And yeah, basically the idea is it's exactly the same. You can output your variables, and remember this goes hand in hand with the fact that you're now dealing with the client, you're dealing with the browser. So that's where you're doing most of your debug, because this is where most of the work is happening. You can still have system.debug to do your Apex work and debug that, but for everything actually on the page, you'll want to use console.log. And Two really, really important tips. If you take nothing away from this except these two, I'll even be happy with that. That's fine. So the most important thing is that Lightning components are case sensitive. The amount of times I tripped up on bugs, the amount of times where I just thought I'd done something so fundamentally wrong, and I was confused as to why things hadn't appeared, and because you're new to the technology, of course, you're checking every controller and every part, but the amount of times it was just down to this capital letter being wrong on a field that I'd retrieved was, I lost count of the times. And each time I was doing that, it was costing me about half an hour. So I quickly learned to pick that up and to recognize that as a problem. So if you can take that and know that when you can't see something on the screen, that's probably why, then that's good. And also, we're quite used to seeing parentheses and an exclamation mark to output our values in Visualforce. It's just good to know that whenever you want to actually do that in a Lightning component, you can just add v dot. You must remember that. Except for Aura iterations, which are effectively like the Apex repeat Visualforce tag. There, it's still the same. It's without the v dot. So, after all those kind of tips and doing my first project, I am very, very happy to say that I have evolved. I am a Lightning developer now, huzzah. But I wouldn't just qualify myself as a Lightning developer. I still hold on to the fact that I still use Visualforce, and I still think there's places where it is appropriate to use Visualforce. There are still times when there is functionality that's just not available in Lightning yet, where you still have to use it. But what's been really good is now when I enter new projects and I go to new customers, I'm now demoing everything in Lightning. And it's very good to feel that you're at that kind of forefront of the technology. And the fact that you can say, oh yeah, this new stuff that's coming out, we're working with it. It's really, really good and helpful. And so when it came to my latest client, which is a GDPR and consent management company, I was able to demo them something in Lightning straight away, and we built the prototype in Lightning, which was really, really good. And now, actually going back to Visualforce feels really dated, if you see what I mean. Just because of the style, just because of the way it works and looks, you genuinely look back on it and think, wow, we should really, update this and not go back. So my advice in terms of picking your first project is really look for that opportunity where there's something which is quite lightweight, not necessarily business essential. I wouldn't recommend that, that your first Lightning project is something really business critical that needs to be out tomorrow. That's probably not very right. So, just think about something that potentially could even be useful to you. If there's not much engagement and there's not much drive for it, think about something that would help you in your job and build something into your Salesforce system that helps you do that, a Lightning component that helps you with that. And I think one of the most important lessons that I can really say is that it's a new technology. You're going to be new to it. You've got to take time. You've got to be patient with what happens. Okay? There are so many frustrating times. There's times I wanted to throw my laptop out the window. There's times that I wanted to go and live in a hut and just do Visualforce, and that's it for the rest of the time. But you've just got to be patient with it. There was a time when you were probably exactly the same about Visualforce, when you just used HTML and didn't really know how to use that, and you went through the frustrations there and you went through the lessons. It's just that exact same process here. So in terms of the future, as I said, I definitely wouldn't see it as that you're no longer a Visualforce developer and now a Lightning developer. It's just like saying the difference between workflow and process builder. It's a different tool for essentially the same job. And the more you know about Salesforce, and we all know this in general, the more you know, the better it is. And the more tools you have access to and the more tools you know about and you feel confident in using, the better you will be as a Salesforce professional. And in terms of Visualforce itself, is it going away anytime soon? No, it's not. It's going to be sticking around for a fair time yet. I mean, you might think that you have quite a big job transitioning from Visualforce to Lightning, but spare a thought for Salesforce. At that time, you look at the Lightning experience, you look at the setup menu items, they're still surfaced in Classic. They're still just Lightning out to the old stuff.
I suspect it will probably be like S controls. You can't create a new one.
Yeah.
If you've already got them, they're not going to go away.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a big task ahead for both us and Salesforce to do that, but I think you could be right in that, absolutely. But yeah, what I'm actually seeing an increase of, at the moment, is actually a combination of the two in terms of Visualforce and Lightning mashups, if that makes sense. We're seeing a lot more attention in things like Lightning out. And as I said, there's capabilities that just aren't possible with Lightning yet. And there's unique things that working with the server gives you. And that's why Visualforce is useful in those kind of situations. So that kind of idea of the mashup could well be something that we see a little bit more of in the future. So don't abandon Visualforce quite yet. Your skills are still needed. So in summary, I like to think that I've given you a brief history of Lightning, kind of explained or even shown you the kind of prejudices that you might have had in your own mind about it and how those might have changed. I'm kind of asking you today to kind of reevaluate that. Look at it again, actually take a look at the platform. It's not the same thing that it was 3 or 4 years ago. Then also, in terms of making that transition, please remember case sensitivity, remember componentization, remember that the emphasis is now on talking to the server as little as possible. You want to make it so that you can build an app that basically works for itself and only needs to talk to Salesforce's servers when it's absolutely necessary. And in terms of the future of development in Salesforce, Visualforce is still going to be around for a while. It's not going anywhere. Salesforce have been very good at saying that. But I think another key thing is we've already started to see features that are Lightning only. And that's where the real turning point comes. Like for me, it was just something like communities, which, okay, is quite isolated, but already, that's the kind of thing where if people are asking for that, you've kind of got to go in that direction. You can do Visualforce community still, but there's a lot of emphasis on that. So those features are going to keep coming and coming. So prepare yourself now, and so you can be better at tackling those challenges when they arise. So I have got a few minutes now for questions if anyone has any. I'm happy to take them after as well. Or if you've got anything that you'd like to confess to yourself, any Visualforce crimes. Yep.
So I guess that at some point, as you sort of transition to Lightning, you kind of reach this sort of critical mass of productivity. As it stands at the minute, if you had a clean slate org and a new requirement, which would you be faster to produce a delivered result with, Visualforce and Apex?
That's a very good question. Still for me, it will be Visualforce. I have to be honest about that. If you said the majority of stuff, and it's because of that familiarity. Yeah. It's because of that. But I guess the question you have to ask is, would I get a better product out of it, if you see what I mean, at the end? Like, in terms of speed of development, because of who I am and because of the experience, the difference between one project and 10 years is quite significant. So yes, I'd be faster at developing in Visualforce, but at the end, would I be happy if that was a completely new org to say, oh, and here's what Salesforce looks like? Then the majority of people who are going to want to interact with that are going to have seen Lightning and go, well, this doesn't look like Salesforce. What's this? So you've got to take that into consideration.
So you'd subset that delay in order to do it, in order to have that?
I would, yeah. And the idea is because you're working more and more in it, that delay becomes less. And hopefully, with things like the Lightning data service, those kind of cool things, that it gets sped up even more and more. Yes?
Yeah, that was really useful. Thanks. I think one of the blockers as well was having to use the dev console as your environment. So what's your experience in the tooling side?
In the tooling side, I still think there's a lot of stuff that's pretty new. I've tried a few different ones, and what's interesting now with the things like the tooling API is people are trying different combinations. I haven't found something that really naturally fits, I'll be honest. I still use the developer console for it because it's got that quite nice interface. But obviously some fans. But I still do use things like the Force.com IDE. I don't like the way that's laid out in terms of all your different component elements are at the bottom and that you can't, as far as I know anyway, create things like the handler. You can't do there. You actually have to go into the dev console and then bring it down. But there's an opportunity there. There really is. So I'm still looking and investigating, but yeah.
I mean, I don't know IntelliJ. There are things around, but
Yeah, I do hear good things about IntelliJ. I'm yet to try it, but I do hear good things. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
How about all the tests that we had to do before in Apex and now?
Yes. So obviously, yes, alongside with Apex changing and the way you have that relationship there, your relationship with testing is changing. Salesforce do not enforce testing on the component code. which some people may say yes, some people may say that's terrible, depending on your developer viewpoint. I think that it needs some more attention. I don't think Salesforce have, fully, thought that through yet. I always thought that Apex testing was a good way of keeping everything compliant, and now that the attention is taken away from there isn't a hard and fast rule yet. But we might see that emerge. But it's still good to see if you can do that yourself, if you see what I mean.
What about continuation?
Continuation? In what sense, sorry?
Basically, like long-running calls, you can convert them into asynchronous using Visualforce. If the same kind of functionality I want to implement in Lightning, it's still not there. So is it a deciding factor to choose Lightning or Visualforce?
Yeah. If it's a lot easier to still do these things in Visualforce, but always concentrate on, don't make that the decision for your entire app, if you see what I mean. If you've got one thing that is going to take a long time, you could still use those mashups to communicate with Visualforce to do that long-running operation and to do that communication if that's absolutely necessary on the server. That's still valid, but don't make that the primary reason for choosing the entire app to be in one technology over another, even if it's just one facet that needs the server more. We good?
Yeah, okay.
Cool. Any more, feel free to come and grab me at the end, but thank you for listening. That's been really good. Thank you. Cheers.